In this podcast episode, Ben Shapiro delves into escalating tensions in Minneapolis surrounding ICE operations and the state government's confrontational stance. He discusses radical left-wing activism linked to recent violence, political rhetoric from Democratic leaders, and the broader implications for law enforcement and public safety. The episode also touches on ongoing protests in Iran, fraud issues in Minnesota's Somali community, that expansive welfare spending and its vulnerabilities, and concludes with a conversation about U.S. energy policy toward Venezuela, featuring Secretary of Energy Chris Wright. The episode opens with a detailed account of the fatal shooting of Renee, a Minnesota mother and activist involved with anti-ICE resistance efforts. Good, known for obstructing ICE operations, was reportedly shot after driving her car toward an ICE agent who reasonably perceived a deadly threat. Her activism was tied to a social justice-focused charter school attended by her child and part of a broader, well-funded coalition of left-wing groups, including organizations supported by George Soros and the Council on American Islamic Relations, dedicated to disrupting ICE enforcement in Minneapolis. The episode critiques the media's downplaying of her activism and highlights a surge in assaults and death threats against ICE officers nationwide. The FBI's refusal to include state law enforcement from Minnesota in the subsequent investigation has heightened friction, with Governor Tim Walz vehemently opposing the exclusion, even as Shapiro expresses distrust in Walz due to his controversial tenure and involvement in fraud allegations. Governor Tim Walz is characterized as escalating the conflict with inflammatory language, likening the current situation to a civil war, and calling for Minnesotans to stand up for their constitutional rights in ways that seem designed to obstruct federal enforcement agencies. His authorization of the National Guard to support local law enforcement raised questions regarding their role, whether to maintain peace or to hinder ICE operations. Walz's politicization of law enforcement accountability and his blame on ICE have fueled a permissive environment for confrontations, increasing danger to officers. The mayor of Minneapolis and other Democratic officials echo this hostile stance, with some describing the shooting as state-sponsored terrorism. Rhetoric, Shapiro argues, is irresponsible and distorts law enforcement's role in upholding legal immigration policies. Shapiro critiques media coverage that, in his view, obscures facts such as Good's obstructive actions and the officer's previous injurious encounter with a vehicle. He points to efforts by prominent Democrats and commentators, including Gavin Newsom and Jacob Fry, to frame ICE operations as authoritarian and brutal, calling these narratives dangerously misleading. Joy Behar's remarks about a dictatorship in the making are cited as an example of hyperbole that contributes to public fear and hostility toward law enforcement. The podcast stresses that this kind of discourse creates a permission structure for violence against ICE agents, who are increasingly targeted. The DHS and officials such as Vice President J.D. Vance advocate for support of ICE and emphasize the consequences for attacks on officers, calling for law and order amid this polarized debate. Another major focus is the intersection of immigration enforcement with widespread fraud issues in Minnesota. The episode points out that many of the fraud cases involve Somali immigrants, with the IRS and Treasury uncovering hundreds of billions in fraudulent claims nationally. The Trump administration is responding by setting up a new Assistant Attorney General role to focus on fraud prosecution. Measures restricting remittances for welfare recipients linked to fraud and investigations expanding beyond Minnesota to other states are underway. Yet, the podcast criticizes local Democratic leaders, including some mayors, for reluctance in addressing fraud claims, suggesting that tolerance of fraud is politically motivated and undermines government programs designed to help legitimate recipients. Expanding welfare programs, such as New York's push for universal childcare, are discussed as areas ripe for increased fraud, especially when funds flow to loosely regulated, home-based providers. The episode outlines how billions in spending on childcare are vulnerable due to difficulties in oversight and historical evidence of mismanagement in similar areas. Attitudes from Democratic officials toward fraud enforcement are portrayed as inconsistent or dismissive, which Shapiro argues perpetuates corruption within government-funded programs and wastes taxpayer money. Shapiro reviews the ongoing massive protests in Iran following internet shutdowns by the regime, suggesting a potential repeat of previous violent crackdowns if international powers do not intervene. President Trump's comments warning Iran of severe consequences if they massacre protesters are cited alongside skepticism about U.S. engagement strategies. The role of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and regime hardliners opposed to foreign influence over demonstrations is also noted, as well as the symbolic revival of pre-revolutionary Iranian symbols by protesters. The situation remains fluid, with the possibility of regime change or brutal suppression looming. In an extended interview, Secretary of Energy Chris Wright explains the strategic U.S. approach to Venezuela's oil industry. Contrary to perceptions of full American energy independence, Venezuelan crude is heavier and particularly suited for specific refinery processes. The administration's novel policy centers on controlling Venezuela's oil exports and revenues to enforce political reforms and curb criminality while encouraging economic stabilization. U.S. oversight of oil sales aims to increase financial leverage, rewarding progress and punishing criminal activities, which in turn would create incentives for Venezuela to move towards democracy and improved governance without plunging into chaos. Wright remarks on the potential for significant increases in Venezuelan oil production under this new framework, and notes the optimism among American companies about re-entering the market amid improving stability and government involvement. The episode closes with preview mentions of future discussions on developments in Cuba, comedy insights from Conan O'Brien, and economic updates. Listeners are encouraged to join the platform with a promotion code for access to ongoing content.